What is the best top 1 in Geometry Dash history? To find out the answer to this question, as well as the difficulties associated with asking it in the first place, I've split up every hardest demon all the way from 2013 to the present day into 3 groups, so that we can pick out the best from each period of the game and then make a final judgment. All my analysis is based on 2 main criteria: the visual appeal of the level and to what extent it's able to play into its role as the hardest demon. The first group is made up entirely of pre-1.9 levels, and although most of the attention they get nowadays is focused on their historical significance and the stories around their creation and rating, assessment of trends in their design is often just as engaging for me. For example, it's definitely still interesting to see the common gameplay tropes that people use to make these older levels challenging, especially in comparison to what is standard practice today, although the limitations imposed on creators back then mean that things get pretty dry after you've seen about 3 of them. The original Hell series is a great example of this. A lot of the gimmicks that Son makes use of, particularly with orbs, are exceptional for the time and still stand out today, but they obviously lose their originality when used so often. This, along with the new design often lacking focus or consistency, is why I'm not the biggest fan of the modern Hell series. One of the trends that is created by the style of gameplay which I find surprisingly adds a lot of value to these levels is choke points. Obviously it doesn't help for playability, but these are top 1s we're talking about, and playability has hardly ever been a main concern. Sections like these ship parts in Icecalm and Diablo X have become identifiers of the levels themselves, being iconic enough to become obvious references to those levels or this period of levels when used in future work. Across this group of levels there also seems to be a pretty consistent gameplay trend of strange obstacle structuring, but unlike the limitation issues I find this concept to be a lot more appealing, mostly because there's a hell of a lot more potential for variety in how it's implemented. There's something I find very charming about the idea of a creator using the editor just to build the most ridiculously difficult gimmick sections they can, and in these circumstances I don't particularly care how it affects music sync, because all the songs that were available at the time just sound like white noise to me now. As for the question of what is actually the best top 1 of this period, I think there are definitely a few solid contenders despite the aforementioned variety issues. Element 111RG and ICDX stick out to me for their gameplay concepts, and Demon Park has some of the most interesting structuring I've seen from a level that was released so early on. However, Stereo Demoness blows its competition out of the water in a combination of these positives with incredibly creative design. I mentioned before that I have this odd fascination with the way these old creators force you through this gauntlet of the weirdest uses of game modes they can possibly think of, and Majako brings some notable structure to this concept with the use of the first proper art in a GD level. Granted, the final product feels incredibly disjointed, and in comparison with something like Back on Mountain it doesn't feel anywhere close to coherent in theming. But I value the inconsistent nature of Stereo Demoness because Majako is able to show off far more individual art pieces in this kind of structure. While the art itself obviously isn't the most advanced or detailed, the use of objects is surprisingly competent at creating unique textures, and anything that isn't a face is also somewhat successful in making the level actually intimidating, although obviously most of the intimidation stems from the style of gameplay. As a result of this, Stereo Demoness not only holds value in the ingenuity of its design, but also in its ability to match its style to its difficulty in a way few other levels did at the time. Moving into 1.9 and 2.0, there's an almost immediate shift away from disconnected individual pieces of gameplay and towards more obviously structured levels. To me, this seems to have been driven largely by the introduction of Newgrounds music, creating additional pressure on creators to sync with the song they're working with. This came alongside huge expansions to the editor's capabilities, with speed portals being an inclusion that was particularly conducive to creators beginning to add more overarching structure to their levels. Decoration standards also increased significantly, as color channels and new triggers allow creators to branch out further with their design levels, and made other styles exponentially more accessible and varied. The player side of the community was also flourishing. This is the period when big names like Riot, Blast, Carmel, Sonics, and Truster really began raising the bar for difficulty. While there was certainly competition at this kind of skill level, the community was still small enough that it was easy to keep track of who the best players were, and very difficult levels were still being beaten rarely enough that their completions felt significant. All of these factors culminated in an incredibly fertile ground for legendary top 1s, and there was no shortage of a follow-up. Unfortunately, 2 of my favourites from 1.9, Fexty and Future Demoness, received very little attention as the hardest level because they were both hacked and only briefly rated in their original forms. The reasons I like these levels mostly come down to their structuring. Both Majako and Espectro had innovative approaches to structuring in their time, with the former having an unparalleled focus on absolute symmetry, whereas the latter feels like what the recent box meta trend should have been aiming to expand on. I think both these creators also use slopes in ways that add a lot of variety to their blocks and gameplay, with Fexty feeling especially lively and energetic as a result of this. There's only a few levels from this period that I don't like, but to criticize many of them almost feels like treading on sacred ground, and before we move on I want to try and break down why that feeling occurs. Firstly, it's important to note that Standards Fall is generally considered a good level and not some nebulous concept construct that spawns out of nothing. They are driven by 1, the depth of the editor, and 2, the capability limit of creators. From these two factors, a very rough baseline measurement of a good level is passively constructed. While this process works for 99% of levels, the nature of top 1s makes it far less applicable to them. Historically, there has been vastly less pressure on the hardest levels to actually look good, because their value has come from their difficulty rather than their visuals, and so the community did not look through that lens when judging them. This is why it feels particularly uncomfortable to go back and assess the visuals of these levels, because it seems like a weak and largely irrelevant challenge to their overall significance in the history of the game. Sonic Wave and Bloodbath are great examples of this. Sonic Wave is literally just the same reskin of 9 Circles that we've been seeing since 2015, and Bloodbath does pretty much everything worse design-wise than the level it's trying to build off. But these are seen by many as great top 1s because the levels have huge historical significance as representations of how stories can be spun from this game and its community. The video essayist's wet dream that is the dramatic rivalry between Cyclic and Riot being the obvious example of this. As weird as it may feel to break away from this perspective of the hardest levels, I don't want my view of the best top 1 of all time to be influenced solely by the hype these levels were able to generate. And for this reason, I don't think either of these levels are particularly deserving of that title. The role that these levels play and the ways they lean into it are certainly still important though, which is something we'll see as we move into 2.0. Although not a great deal changed in terms of standards for top 1s in this update, which is why I chose to keep it in the same section as 1.9, 2.0 is my favourite period in the game's history, and so it makes sense that a lot of the post-Bloodbath hardest levels are appealing to me. The greatly increased pressure on these levels to be provably legitimately verified also adds significant prestige and notability to the hardest levels, which have been lost in earlier updates. Athanatos is one of the few examples of a hacked 2.0 top 1, but that takes little away from it to me because it's one of my favourite hell-like levels ever to come out. The use of shadows and glow in the design alongside the dash of memory in the gameplay gives it a dark and mysterious vibe that really makes it stand out from more lackluster red levels. And unlike those levels, the occasional edginess very rarely gets in the way of the level's appeal, because it's mostly generated by the atmosphere of the decoration rather than anything more clearly deliberate. As for legit verifications, the Coop in Hell is definitely up there for me, mostly because I think its style of gameplay is incredibly iconic and criminally underused. The design is also pretty damn good for a level this old, and it's aided significantly by the same kind of colours that work just as well in Cataclysm. Now, as for answering the question of which is the best, Artificial Ascent is doubtless the level many will go to, and while I totally understand why, it's not my first choice. Design-wise, it's certainly one of the best levels of 2.0, with the consistent excellent management of colours being one of its main draws. On a more conceptual level though, Artificial feels lackluster. It does a very poor job at following through on the technology theme, or even the original inspiration from Cataclysm. The second of these arguably being more important because it would have been far more helpful in establishing this thematically as the hardest level. The form of the level that we eventually got feels uncomfortably at odds with its insane difficulty for the time, which is why Yatagarasu comes out on top for me as the best top 1 of 1.9 and 2.0. Unlike Artificial, it's very well designed to reflect its difficulty through a range of actual and abstract means, with the gameplay and length being the most obvious examples of the former. If you know anything at all about the game, then Yatagarasu seems immensely difficult, and for a skilled player, the fact that it's almost 3 minutes long works wonders to make it a memorable experience. However, the theme that Yatagarasu aims for is arguably just as important, even if it's paired with a colour scheme that it feels cliched to call cliched. This level is unique because despite having a very obvious candidate for a boss fight, it never chooses to lean into that kind of structure, and I think this choice is far better for making the level feel intimidating, especially because of the way in which its namesake appears and interacts with the player throughout the level. As well as succeeding in reflecting the difficulty, the visuals are also very solid in and of themselves. For a mega collab of this length, it's surprising to me how few of the parts I dislike, and how effective most of them are in their use of the song. The standout part to me in this regard has always been Heinz. The Swingcopter is an absolutely phenomenal choice to reflect the crescendo into Evasium, and I particularly like the uncompromising claustrophobia of the ship. The other parts aren't far behind either. Viprin, Michigan, Anubis, CSX, and almost all the other creators contributed excellent parts, and it leaves Yatagarasu not only a successful top 1 but a high quality level, and certainly one good enough to act as the finale of 2.0. As we move into 2.1, it becomes clear that standards for the hardest levels in the game have shifted once again. This change is down to one thing: oversaturation. A larger player base than ever alongside a ridiculous amount of time spent in the update means more people have gotten used to the mechanics of the game, resulting in a greater number of top players than ever seen before, which means that a higher number of difficult levels are able to be released in a shorter time span. More competition between these levels reduces the value they gain through difficulty that we talked about earlier, which has resulted in one of the most significant changes in the history of the GD community. The high hype for top 1s is nowhere near close to unanimous anymore. What has occurred as a consequence of this change is a growing demand for top 1s to actually look good, but since this demand hasn't resulted in anything particularly tangible, there's been an increasing amount of drama and division around these levels actually getting rated. The best level of this update was very hard to pick, but unlike 1.9 and 2.0, it wasn't down to the number of great candidates, but rather the lack of any good ones. I still have things I want to say about most of them though, so I thought I might as well just go through all of them chronologically. Erebus is the first top 1 that came out in 2.1, and despite the reputation of the creators who worked on it, it's definitely one of the ugliest. I admire the creativity of the theme and some of the gameplay from a visual standpoint, but beyond that there's really nothing positive to say about it. Stalemate Redux is excellent at building tension towards the end, but is sorely lacking in pulse work or movement to keep it feeling lively in the earlier sections. And I find its radioactive counterpart Biohazard to be a lot more effective in taking advantage of the kind of structure that it utilizes. Digital Descent is a mixed bag of parts who lag behind expectations of their creators, and some of the most timeless design work I've ever seen looking back. It has the same problem as Artificial in that it doesn't really feel like it was made to be the hardest level, but its placement was hardly considered to be accurate even at the time, so that's not a concern of any particular note. Plasma Pulse Finale is fine. Being the final part of a long-running series that increased in difficulty certainly gives it hype value, but the design is very inconsistent in quality and rarely feels like it's making the most of the song. Bloodlust is pretty awful. The color scheme very rarely works with the kind of complexity and detail that it aims for, although the extension has quite a few interesting parts, including the iconic corridor. I don't think Crimson Planet is quite as bad as some people at the time were making out, although it's pretty embarrassing that one of the best parts is just an unused part from Yatagarasu, and it honestly shocked me to find out that PPS used to have his name in this level even more than he already does. Zodiac's quality is carried entirely by the fact that it uses almost the whole song. Even the best parts are still underwhelming, although it's difficult to blame the creators entirely when they were tasked with working with some of Cryo's most soulless music. Tartarus is one of the best levels on this list in terms of feeling like a top 1, given the unique verification process and its historical significance. However, the actual design is generally pretty mediocre, and the stylistic restrictions don't feel like a valid excuse for this given that Salaxium absolutely owns the rest of the creators with his use of color. The Golden is one of my least favorite extremes, simply because it completely fails to build off the theming or sense of exploration in El Dorado in any meaningful way, and instead chooses to coat everything in 200 layers of black glow and mute the colors beyond belief. Firework is fairly decent. I like that the decoration doesn't try and get in the way of the brilliant gameplay, and once again the length is very useful in making it stand out. However, it would have been a hell of a lot better if the creators were either told to stick to a specific theme or avoid theming altogether, because this level has the topical consistency of a stand-up comedian who only just discovered segues. Slaughterhouse is a pretty bad level, but it's a pretty good top 1. The gameplay has basically nothing to do with the original Slaughterhouse, but in many ways it feels like a more structured version of impossible levels from the earliest periods of the game, and similarly to Yatagarasu, it looks incredibly difficult. People have mixed opinions on the implementation of the art, but I think this skull at least is a very unique way to break up the gameplay, although unique probably isn't the first word I use to describe the art itself. Coop in Circles is really not very interesting to me, mostly because the original Impossible level feels incredibly insignificant in the vast swath of levels basically exactly like it. I don't feel like the lack of balancing contributes to this being a particularly iconic level as it did for older ones either. Abyss of Darkness had an incredibly rough road to getting rated, and quite honestly I'm not surprised. The base gameplay is so poorly constructed that all the attempts made by the participants to turn it into an actually decent level fall flat for me. The black hole part shows some promise, but that theme is never expanded on or continued in any other part, so there's not much more to say about it. Acheron is the most recent top 1 we've got, and I'm really not a fan of it. Everything about it just feels so unnatural. The song choice, the colors, the weird mix of 1.9 and 2.1 design, and the fact that it has zero ties to anything historical except Tartarus make it feel like a very underwhelming top 1, especially coming right after Slaughterhouse. As you can tell, there's not a lot of choice when deciding what the best level of this era is. In the final decision I made, there's a weird parallel to my thought process for the previous group of levels. While Digital Descent is undoubtedly the best in terms of visual quality, as a top 1 I think Slaughterhouse works far better. Although it's certainly extremely derivative, and the lack of a cohesive style significantly reduces immersion, I think the gameplay and some of the small touches in the decoration make it appeal more to me as the hardest level, even if it undoubtedly goes overboard with edginess in places. This conclusion is one that really surprised me because I'm definitely not the biggest fan of Slaughterhouse. It really puts into perspective how weak the the rest of the competition is. I don't think this is entirely the fault of the creators though. We've already discussed many of the factors external to these levels that cause them to flop, and I feel like there's certainly an underlying struggle to find ways to make top 1s intimidating without making them cliché that needs to be taken into account. These types of external factors have led to an interesting impact on the final conclusion of this video. It's clear that the task of determining the best top 1 of all time is made significantly more difficult with consideration of various environmental conditions present at different times. Before 1.9, there wasn't really a sizable enough community or enough options in the editor to create something that truly felt fitting as a top 1. And in the later stages of 2.1, the community has become too large for hype to consistently build around these types of levels. This already puts Stereo Demoness and Slaughterhouse at a disadvantage in competition against Yatagarasu, which was created in the ideal period for these types of levels to be released. This is the reason why I thought it was worth splitting up my assessment into different sections to begin with. And if you think the comparison of these eras is inherently flawed in the way that it necessarily draws focus to factors external to the quality of the levels themselves, then I think that's a perfectly valid conclusion to come to. However, you came all this way expecting an answer, and I think I can still be justified in saying that Yatagarasu's ability to match his position in the community, as well as its outstanding visual quality amongst its competition, means that it is the best top 1 in GD history.